Welcome to Restaurants Reinvented, the podcast for restaurant executives where we go beyond the four walls of the store and talk about industry, trends, strategies, and challenges that the C-suite tackles every day. Your host is Jen Kern, a career marketer across multiple industries and the CMO of QBeyond. Now let's get started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Restaurants Reinvented. This is Jen Kern. I'm the hostess of your show here from Q. And with me today, I have two lovely guests, both authors and founders of companies in their own rights. I've got Carl Orsbourn and Meredith Sandland with me today. Welcome, guys, to the show.
Thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Yeah. And not your first rodeo on Restaurants Reinvented. This is the second one to match your second book.
Exactly.
That's right. We're super excited to be back with you. The first one was a great time.
It really was. And so the second book is now we're taking the delivering the digital restaurant to the next level, and we're talking about the path to digital maturity. Talk to me a little bit about that, Meredith. Where did you come up with this idea of the path to digital maturity, and why is that so important for restaurants to understand today?
Well, I think Carl came up with it, to be fair, but the idea was, we wrote this first book about the why all this stuff is important and why you have to take digital seriously and, why the industry is changing so much. And then, of course, the pandemic happened and proved all that to be a necessity. But as Carl and I were going around the industry speaking with restaurant owners and speaking with chains and talking at all the conventions, we kept getting the same questions over and over again about, okay, I get it, I accept it, it's important, but how do I actually do it? And what was interesting was the how questions were different based on, kind of the starting point of each brand or restaurant that was asking us these questions. And so, we started to put together, well, you need to do this, you need to do that, you need to do this, all these different things. And we realized you can't do them all at once. It's not possible. You have to start with the foundation and then take steps and go along until you end up a fully digitally mature restaurant.
And I think one of the things that surprised everyone that has read the book so far is that we try and present it in a relatively linear fashion. We recognize that's not necessarily the reality, but the pandemic has kind of created a level of chaos because we reckon most restaurants now are deploying somewhere between 15 and 20 different pieces of technology, and different pieces of technology really support different places of maturity. And so there's probably a whole bunch of that 15 to 20 items that are being utilized that aren't really being utilized to their full capacity. And, we're in a year of where folks are starting to think about how to really prioritize what to focus on, where to deploy their spend when it comes to tech. And hopefully the book will help a level of self-reflection. Every chapter has a worksheet at the back where we encourage the reader to say, where are you on this? How does this resonate with where you are? And so we hope by the end of the book, everyone can find their place, their chapter where they're at and say, right, now I know where I'm at. This is where I should focus. Let's get good at this. And then we can move on. And I think that is the whole intent behind the book.
Yeah. Well, I think you did a great job because I have gotten an early release of the book and noticed all the great questions and sort of like workbook. I know there is a companion workbook, but I feel like there's a workbook inside the book too. So at the end of each chapter, all the questions that you have there, I found it incredibly helpful, even not being, owning a restaurant, but still just things to think through. It was very tactical and tangible. So great job with that. Something I'd like to start off here with is you introduced a concept that I hadn't really heard before. I think maybe I heard you mention it once or twice in our one-off conversations, but the concept is the digitally native restaurant. And you guys are taking big bets on this. You believe that the digitally native restaurant is going to be the next big thing to hit our industry. Please explain.
Oh, goodness. I'll get super excited as I talk about this. So cut me off if I go on too long. I look at the industry and I say, gosh, nothing's really changed since fast casual, really. Like we had QSR, we had delivered pizza, we had casual dining, we had fast casual, and then what? What happens after fast casual? It's been over 20 years since that segment was invented. And, it's still alive and well, doing great things. but there really hasn't been anything new. And I think most restaurant people, when they hear that, are like, wait. No, there's been all this digital stuff and we have online ordering and we're doing delivery, like all that's new. True. But it hasn't fundamentally changed the business model of a restaurant. All it's done is like tack things on the side of existing restaurants. And all the different segments are trying to deal with it, each in their own way. And the digitally native restaurant, we believe, is a new segment that will become the high growth segment of the industry. And it is one that is, born on the internet and makes full use of all the digital tools, both front of house and back of house, to serve their customer. And we believe it will be faster growth than the rest of the industry because it will be optimized to serve these digital channels. And these digital channels are where the growth is for the industry, right? Like, even though on-premise dining has come back to a great extent from before the pandemic, the off-premise stuff hasn't gone away. And if you include off-premise, in its entirety, including delivery, takeout, curbside, mobile online pickup, all of these different bits and pieces, that is only going to continue to grow. So the next restaurant chain that really figures out how to optimize for those things is going to blow up. And believe it or not, there are dozens, possibly hundreds of these out there in the US today, independent restaurants experimenting with this model. And we predict that they are going to figure it out and become the thing.
So interesting. So your definition, restaurant could include on-prem dining, correct? Or not?
Well, it's optimized for off-prem. So I would say it's delivery centric. And I think the thing I would compare it most closely to is the creation of the delivery carryout or Delco unit in pizza, right? So in the old days, if you're as old as we are, Jen, I don't know. I'll let the listeners guess about that one, but you might remember from your childhood, or maybe not if you're too young, but you might remember when you got pizza, you went with your parents to a dine-in restaurant that had a tabletop as Pac-Man and a salad bar and, a jukebox and a pinball machine, and you sat down and you ate pizza. Well, now that's crazy, right? Like, who goes to a restaurant, sits down and eats pizza? Nobody does that, right? You get it delivered. And how did that happen? Well, it happened because Domino's came along and invented the delivery carryout unit. No one in their right mind would ever eat inside a Domino's. I'm not sure it's even possible to. I've never been to one that has seats in it, right? And then they innovated everything around making it as easy as possible for consumers to get that delivered pizza, starting with the phone call and the 30-minute delivery guarantee, and then innovating their digital platforms, online ordering. And then most recently, as we talked about in our digital restaurant podcast last week, enabling in-cart ordering. This is the future, I think, for the rest of the cuisine types as well.
Well, first of all, I'm glad that I am not part of the old crowd that you chose to join yourself in that one, Meredith. So I'm glad that even though we're only a couple of years apart, but I'll give the voice of youth into this. The thing I'd say, Jen, is look, in the first book, we talked about drive-through and how you think about the QSR model in the 60s and 70s of how that had to adapt to drive-through and the second make line development, all the different operational processes that had to be tweaked and modified, and even the design of the back of house that had to be modified to accommodate a channel that is now so significant to QSRs. And I think what we're putting out there is to be able to say, well, you can do that. And there's certainly many restaurants out there, Chipotle is probably a great example, that are following that same idea of being able to support the digital ordering systems that exist. But actually for many restaurants, to really get the best food, to get the best delivery mechanisms, to actually ensure that accuracy, quality, and speed are upheld to everything the customer should expect, really it's about simplifying it. And so we're not saying that the idea of having on-premise and off-premise restaurants aren't going to exist anymore. They are. But the best delivered food will come out of this category.
Okay. The best delivered food. That makes sense. That's making a lot of sense to me now. So when we're talking about this path of digital maturity, have you found that a lot of restaurant operators are kind of breathing a collective sigh of relief, if you will, that this is not a once and done process. This is not a let's go out and find the right widget or the right technology system or platform and we're done. The way that you map it out in your book, and it is on a spectrum, and it's a two-part question. I think the digitally native restaurant is somewhere in that spectrum, maybe can fall anywhere. But have you found that there is a sigh of relief that what I heard like a year and a half ago, that the restaurant industry is just in first inning of digital transformation? Maybe now we're inching into the second inning. You find that people are relieved to hear that news, that they already know that news, and how is it landing on folks?
I think the reality is that probably 70 to 80% of restaurants, certainly independents, rest in the first two chapters of this book still. I think we often, because, we're always in this space, we're talking about the latest and greatest things. Jen, we're only doing it a few days ago ourselves, but I think most restaurants are still trying to figure it out. And, the first two chapters of the book are about third-party optimization and developing your own direct channel and thinking about things like UX and making sure you're creating frictionless ordering processes. And that, in many ways, is still where restaurants are at. So I think the sigh of relief is certainly there in the sense of the return of on-prem and the fact that they have got a business to, build upon now. And I think the difference between now and our first book that was released is that restaurants realize this is here to stay, that this is absolutely has to be part of the business model. This absolutely has to be something they have to build for. And I think we're getting there, but I'm not sure everyone's thinking, okay, I've got this now. And that's, again, one of the reasons we wrote this book.
hmm hmm Okay. So you're saying independents you think are mostly in the first two chapters, which by the way were excellent because you really did do a great job of talking about the new marketing paradigm. And I thought as a marketer, you had great tools in there for marketers to start with. So yeah, the first two chapters, great. Acquisition, retention, marketing, looking at your data. That's all great stuff. And I think it applies also to the larger change. I mean, most of the audience here is fast casual QSR, I would say. They might also still be in the first two. They might be adapting some of the later chapters and looking at the holistic technology, which comes towards the end. But I'm just curious where you see most of the audience for this book being. Do you see it being mostly independents then?
I think it applies to
That's
everyone.
well, first of all, amazing compliment coming from you, Jen, as a
Yeah.
marketer. Since
Mhm.
Carl is an ops person and I'm a finance person, so we have learned a lot about marketing as we've gone through this process and talked to so many other folks in the industry about what they're doing. And the interviews with all the different tech companies and executives have been incredibly helpful to do that. But thank you for highlighting that.
Mhm.
And yes, the first two chapters are about how do you market in this new world. And I would say many chains have made huge leaps and bounds here. But when you look at something as simple as like the data, the percent digital of orders coming through by chain, and then of those digital orders, the percent first party versus third party, even among chains, there's a huge dispersion of outcomes. And that tells me that they have a different level of capability, right? Or they would all be doing about the same. And so I think you're right. Chains absolutely can benefit from thinking through a lot of these things, but it is more likely that the independents have not made any strides on this because they can't afford the big internal teams, consumer insight people and marketers and analysts, and, fleet people looking at the data, trying to help them figure out what to do. And so, yes, in a lot of ways, we wrote the book with the independent restaurant as our muse, knowing that they don't have those same resources that the big chains do. But yeah, absolutely does not mean that the big chains can't benefit from it too.
Some
Yeah.
of the chains,
And
Jen, I think are now getting to a place where they're hiring people in from other industries. They're coming from
yeah,
e-commerce backgrounds. Like the amount of
right.
CMOs I meet now or the directors of marketing that have had experience in digital retailers. And their comments often are, look, I know where this is going. I've seen it happen before.
Right.
Now it's a case of trying to align the rest of my colleagues, my peer group, to have that same mindset and to, again, develop their own strategy forward. So I think the capabilities are starting to get there now. It's about mindset and direction and being able to prioritize, because the other side of this that I hope comes through the book is that this isn't about CTOs. Technology now affects every part of
Right.
a restaurant. And you can't look to the CTO to say, right, I need this solution. Off you go and come back once it's implemented. It has to be a joined up operation. And that prioritization is a factor. And of course, it comes back to operations again, because if the technology is great, but the execution of the order is poor, ultimately marketing is not going to be happy because the sales aren't going to be coming through. And then people come back to the CTO and say, well, your technology's not working. And it's completely a collaborative exercise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I think that's good to know. And maybe that'll encourage more people to get the book and to look at the book, because sometimes I think it's daunting looking at like a business that has like steps for progress. And if you can pick it up and kind of pick the chapter, because each chapter really can be looked at independently. And like, here's where my restaurant needs help. Meredith, you just mentioned the data. There's a chapter on mining data, and you could just go and spend time in that chapter and learn so much. So for folks maybe like, oh, I don't want to read another business book or restaurant book or whatever it might be, think of it differently. Think of it as like sort of an evergreen, manual, if you will, that you could pick up and just remember certain things about the business that you could be using to optimize. And I'm all for, helping the industry and getting good content out there that's really going to help. And I think when we talk about data, it's such a big topic now. It makes me laugh because it's like it's always been, but it's more relevant than ever because people are starting to see that without that, they really don't have a scalable business. There was one thing in your book that I was so happy to see, and it said, master menu data is the root of all data. And I was so happy to see that because one of our challenges here at Q around our branding and positioning is helping people understand how we're different. And we talk about, it's not sexy, but we talk about we create the menu. We live at the foundational level of your business, creating that level and that layer data that's so foundational at everything you do. And so when you're pushing it out and pulling it back in and grabbing all the other data and adding it on, you have a foundational home to come back to, if you will, that normalizes the data. And that's kind of, it's not a sexy sell, and it's not, to some people it doesn't make sense. But when I saw it in there, I thought, yes, we're making progress. Like this menu data is so important. Tell me your experience learning about that and where that came from.
Yeah, I first of all, I think it's absolutely true, and I think that's one of the things that we really admire about Q is that shared perspective of why the menu data is so important. But I think restaurants, because of how much innovation happened at the front end first, meaning like how we interact with consumers, and because consumers are the ones who create the revenue, I think we all got really excited about consumer data, and we started to think about our consumers and how do we track that data and what do we do with it. But ultimately, it doesn't mean anything if you can't link it back to what are they buying? How often do they buy those things? Do they repeat on those certain items? Do they modify them? How do they modify them? Do they buy them when they're on special or when they're full price? Like all of those, which channels do they buy them through? Their decisions come back to that base menu. And then that menu carries all the way back through the restaurant, not just on that front end, but on the back end, right? So how do we have the inventory to make those items? What are our prep cycles like? How much of it should we make for any given day? All of those things are tied to specific menu items. And if you think about it as almost an ERP for the restaurant industry, if you didn't have a bill of materials in a manufacturing plant, you could not function. You couldn't make anything, right? And in a lot of ways, that menu data acts as the bill of materials for a restaurant.
Yeah.
Yeah. I was only talking to our good friend Nico the other day about one of my clients at Juicer, and we were talking about modifiers. And of course, we know variability and customization is increasingly a part of the restaurant experience. And I think more and more consumers expect that no matter what type of restaurant you're at. And we were talking about just how even a modifier can actually be detailed in a menu. And we get into situations where only the subtotal comes out, and therefore you're not actually getting detailed information about the amount of modifiers that are being put onto different products. And of course, with Juicer and dynamic pricing, that's a big factor. And so it's as much about the infrastructure and setting up the menu right from the very beginning, and working with a technology provider that enables you to do that. That's then going to create those foundations for you to build upon, whether it leads to customer information and the way in which you build that for later, or cost of product like Meredith mentions, or in the eventual price that you charge consumers through different channels.
Yeah. Well, dynamic pricing, we all know we've got to stay on top of the pricing. And I know you do touch on that in the book. Let's talk about holistic technology. So this is one of the later chapters. And there are two stats that you mentioned in this chapter. At the beginning, you say for digitally mature restaurants, they will spend 2 to 4% of their sales on technology. And then there was this stat that you mentioned as well, Carl, earlier, which is it's going to take 15 to 20 pieces of software to run that digital restaurant well. And those softwares break down into 6 different functions. So in terms of the holistic technology, let's talk about what led you, first of all, to uncover those stats and land there. And then where do you see the holistic technology really fitting into the equation?
Well, the
Maybe
starting
let's
point,
start with the statistics. So the 2 to 4%, I think we are starting to see franchisors put in their franchise disclosure document expected spend on technology as part of the total business model package that a franchisee is signing up for. Some of them will even go as far as to put a technology fee into the types of fees that a franchisee has to pay to the franchisor to cover some of the technology things that are happening back at the ranch. And so it's clear that technology spend is becoming meaningful at restaurants, right? When a franchisor has to disclose it, that means it's a big part of the business, as important as food and paper and labor and occupancy and all the other things that restaurants spend on. Certainly in talking with both restaurant chains and independents, that number comes up again and again and again, that's about where people settle out. That, of course, is excluding any of the fees that people are paying to a third-party marketplace, like a marketplace fee or digital advertising, and excludes any fulfillment fees that they might be paying, like if they're using a back-end delivery company, a local delivery company to fulfill. So literally just the technology. And I would argue that if you're spending less than 2%, you are not spending enough and you are way behind. So I would start there, right? Because I think when people hear that number, 2 to 4%, they're, gosh, that's a lot. What does it come out of? How can I possibly pay for that? If you aren't spending that, you are behind. So let's say that's something that needs to happen. But then the 15 to 20 different pieces of technology, again, this is talking to kind of 2 sources, all of the different restaurants and they'll tell us what their tech stack is. And as they walk through the tech stack and you start counting the number of different things that they have put together, it tends to be around 15 to 20 for someone who's doing a pretty sophisticated digital delivery business. And that has been true for a while now. I think the very first place I saw it was at Tech Table in the year 2019, which was a conference that was held in New York. And 3 restaurants got up on stage and literally just put their tech stacks up and started talking about this is what we're using for each piece, 15 to 20 different things. And that has just been reinforced and reinforced and reinforced as we've gone through and talked to people. And where the idea of holistic technology comes from is out of these 2 facts. Because when you realize that you're spending this much money on this complex of a system, you start to ask yourself, maybe I need to go back to first principles. It is possible that, what has happened in the restaurant industry, we tend to 1% better every day. And so we solve a problem, uncovers a new opportunity or problem we know about, we solve that one. And then that uncovers a new opportunity or problem and we solve that one. And every time we solve a problem, we add a piece of technology. And all of a sudden we have this really heavy thing. And now we're spending 4% of sales on technology and we have 20 different pieces of software. And it might be that if you went back to the root and said, what is the simplest way to solve this problem? You would come up with a totally different answer. And that answer might be, for some people, holistic technology, which would be restaurant operating system that does essentially all parts pieces together in one piece of software. And there are relatively few players out there doing it today. Certainly that's the approach that Empower Delivery takes for its specific niche in delivery-centric restaurants. But you can see a bunch of players starting to gobble up as they consolidate the tech industry, starting to gobble up adjacent pieces to try to make something that's a little bit more holistic. I think Toast and Olo probably are the poster child of this as they buy things in pieces of the restaurant technology stack that are adjacent to the core place that they began.
Okay, so that fits your definition of holistic technology is acquiring pieces that fit the 6 functions.
Say acquiring or building, right? And having it all be truly inside one system.
Mhm.
So not necessarily just an API that allows the technology to talk to the different pieces, but something that's truly like able to control. And so then, it's a funny chapter because it presents this idea of holistic technology. It's all one piece of software. And because it's all one thing, it can control, all different facets of the technology.
Mhm.
But, there are many companies, yours included, Jen, that take a very different approach, which is to say, actually, there's a lot of awesome software out there, best of breed. If you want to go get those pieces of software and put them together, we're going to make it easy for you to use all the different things that you want to use rather than having to Frankenstein this stuff together, which is how a lot of companies end up having to do it when they're not on a system like Q.
Mhm.
And then we talk about, okay, if that's the path you want to go down, then maybe instead of just an API, we need to get to a place of interoperability.
So
I
more
think
like
when
a
we,
headless system.
yeah, like a headless system. But I mean, a lot of people don't really know what headless systems are, right? I mean,
Yeah.
the amount of
Yeah.
times I talk about it with folks, they go, what are you on about? And so
Yeah.
I think what we're trying to say here is, how can you create a system which talks to all the different parts? I mean, typically today, most people hear about the term integration, they think of an API and they think, right, well, that's enabling me and my platform to be able to talk to the host system, the POS, more often than not. But the problem is that allows the host system and that piece of technology to talk to each other. And that's where it stops. And so, the example I often use, and I think we reference it in the book, is, imagine a world whereby you have two line cooks that call out this evening. And so as a result of that, typically what happens in today's world is that the restaurant GM has to scramble. There isn't a piece of technology out there today that helps that restaurant GM figure out what they need to do differently. But imagine if that piece of information, when those two line cooks call out, were then able to have a connection, not just to the 7 shifts or to the system that manages payroll, but actually then reaches out to OpenTable and says, right, we need to reduce the amount of available tables tonight to serve. Or reach out to my company, Inducer, and so therefore we raise the prices a little bit, just to stem some of the demand that's coming through the off-premise channels. This ability to create a symbiotic system where all of the different data inputs can talk to each other and ultimately inform better decision making, that can then aid in the operations. And if you can aid the operations, you can create a better customer experience. And so that's where I see, and the final chapter, this chapter we're talking about, it's written to us, it's written to the technologists, it's not written to the restaurants. It's saying, if we are going to help restaurants get better at this, we have to work better together. And I think that's the
Right.
theme of both elements.
Right. I think the one thing I would add there is something we talk about, which is not all APIs are created equal. And I think when we started talking about APIs in the restaurant industry, like you said about headless, I mean, you can't expect people that aren't in tech to know what that means, or you haven't spent a lot of years in tech to know what that means. It took me a long time to understand what headless meant. And I worked for a company that did headless technology a couple years ago, right? It's pretty complex. And it's the same thing with APIs. And so when we have people come to us now and they say, we want to see your API documentation, I go, hooray, right? Because they know that just because we have an API and the other company has an API doesn't mean it's going to work the way we're talking about. It doesn't mean, the information is going to go back and forth. And there are some APIs, and depending on how they're architected, that can help. And if you've got a system like Q at the foundational level, bringing everything back down, normalizing, and pushing it back out to all the systems. So it's not just a one-to-one relationship everywhere you go. And so I think the understanding and the education around APIs is really important as well as microservices, understanding what does a microservices system, give you? What does it mean to be multi-tenant versus single tenant? We've heard a lot of cases recently about customers getting hacked, about systems being restaurants being down because they're being hacked. And a lot of it goes back to this single tenant, non-native cloud, crappy APIs, right? No fault of anyone's, because this is an industry rapidly evolving and it's hard to keep up with the modern stuff. I think understanding that stuff and having these conversations and talking about these things and arming the people that are running the restaurants with some of this information so that they can ask these questions, right? Like, how are your APIs different than so-and-so's? And if I expect you to integrate to these 15 pieces of software, what do I get?
Yeah. What actually happens?
Yeah.
That's
What
so
kind
true.
of data am I going to get?
So true. I love
Yeah.
the phrase, not all APIs are created equal. I think that's very good. And I'm sure you guys say this in your marketing materials all the time because I've seen them, but talking about native cloud and what does it mean to be native cloud. And
Mm-hmm.
I guess I would also flip that concept on its head and say, if you aren't, what are the
Mm-hmm.
likely consequences of that? Well, one of the consequences is that you probably have a lot of tech debt, right? You probably
Mm-hmm.
wrote code a long time ago that now you're spending a lot of time fixing and updating and trying to make it work in the modern world instead of innovating and pushing the envelope on what your technology is capable of. And so when you start as a native cloud piece of software, you are able to think about the architecture totally differently. You're able to think about how you interact with other pieces of software totally differently. And you're
Right.
able to really focus your time on innovation rather than having to think backwards of "Well, how do we fill that gap? How do we solve that problem? This was never
Mm.
made to do this because, we invented at a time when that didn't exist, right?
Right. Right.
And that is hugely important as a foundational piece to anything that people want to accomplish in this modern world of
Mm.
restaurant digitization.
Right. And this is why we're very bullish about edge computing, because edge computing is computing that is done very close to the source of the data. So it has implications for security, it has implications for speed, efficiency, making real-time decisions, all that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, a lot of the larger chains believe it will be hard for them to incorporate edge because of their technical debt, because of what you just talked about, right? And so I think there will be applications for it. We're using it. We're seeing applications for it. It's in the more mid-size companies. And I think the digitally native, back to our first topic of the digitally native restaurant, we would have huge benefits there as well. So loyalty. Let's jump to loyalty. Let's talk about loyalty a second. Because I'm going to do I did my homework here. Isn't this great? Loyalty is no longer necessary for all restaurants. Carl, what do you say?
Well, we touch on loyalty all the way through the book. And we do that because in a way, a lot of restaurants are always, probably the most frequent question I get is, do I need an app? And and I have that all the time. And I say, well, what do you need an app for? And they go, well, I need it for loyalty. And I say, well, sure, but how many customers are you actually having today that are coming through your direct channel, through your website? Do you have a mobile web? Or, the reality is that many restaurants that don't have scale don't necessarily need an app. They need to have a way of being able to create an interface for their customers to work, order from them. But an app isn't necessarily the way to do it. And ultimately, what does the customer want? What does the customer want when it comes to having a relationship with a restaurant brand, with food that they enjoy? They want to be able to have a consistent experience. They want the restaurant to basically understand who they are. And that can come in many different ways beyond points and punch cards. It can come in being able to create a wonderful seamless experience. If you can create an experience that matches what has otherwise been habitualized through fantastic user experience on like a DoorDash or an Uber Eats, then actually you're creating a reason for a customer to go back and be loyal to using the direct channel. We use this term, count the clicks. Yeah, you remember that one in the book? And that is all about trying to make sure you've got a clear idea on the amount of steps it takes to order through your direct channel. And if you don't have a consistent amount of steps, or at least close to a consistent amount of steps to what you might order through a third party, you're creating reasons for a guest to be disloyal to your own platform. The other piece of this is understanding where you're ready to be able to utilize customer data. So clearly, if you can create that frictionless experience, if you can create a platform, whether it be through an app or through mobile web, if you can create an experience and then capture that customer data, are you ready to do something with that data? What are you doing to connect that data together across each of your channels of ordering? So today, many restaurants probably have got open table or some form of table reservation program, perhaps. And if for those folks, that they have data already. How much are they using that data to be able to reach out to their customers? So I think we try and frame the term around loyalty as how do you want to create a better customer experience to improve the way in which the customer can react and communicate with your restaurant, and of course, drive trip frequency. And there are more ways than just loyalty programs.
Yeah. So if I were to say for our audience, you need to consider having a loyalty fill in the blank. How would someone know if they need it or if they don't need it?
That's a good question. I'm curious about Carl's answer because I don't think we phrased it exactly that way in the book. So I'll start and then we'll see what he says. But
Okay.
I would say you need to consider a loyalty app if you don't have a lot of customer data and you want to get access to customer data. The number one thing that a loyalty app does is co-opt your consumer into sharing their behavior with you by giving them a reward for doing so. So if you want to develop a way to get customer data, it's a great way to do it. The second reason I would say you need a customer app, regardless of whether or not you have customer data, is are you prepared then to use that data, as Carl just alluded to in his previous question, are you prepared to use that data to drive consumer behavior? And if you are, and you know, I'm going to tell people who look like this to do that, and people who behave like this to do that, and I'm going to send these kinds of messages to those people, and I'm going to customize these offers in this way. If you're ready to do those things, then a loyalty platform makes a ton of sense. If you already have a ton of customer data and you aren't going to be sending a lot of personalized messages to people, probably don't need a loyalty app.
Yeah, we're obviously at RLC recently, and a certain Mr. Greg Flynn said he thinks loyalty programs are a way to just to discount your offer to your most loyal customers, right? And so I think it's got to be something more than just being able to create a system which allows you to just reward loyal customers. You've got to be able to look beyond that. And I think there's something about whether you're willing to be simplistic in the way in which you engage with your customers. And so what I mean by that is if you make a loyalty program really complicated, the chances are you won't get the engagement. One loyalty provider we refer to in the book, Zach Goldstein's Thanks, uses something as simple as a checkbox, for example, when someone puts in their credit card information, and that is the automatic sign up to the loyalty program. I mean, in many ways, how much do you really need to call out that a customer is joining a loyalty program? If you find that a credit card or an address or some form of customer identifier is reflecting a customer that comes and procures from you regularly, then they are by nature a loyal customer. And then it's your choice as to how you want to treat them. And I think many restaurants need to actually say, not all loyalty programs need to be equal in how they service different customers. The value-orientated guests, the ones that do react to a discounted offer or a percentage off, might need a different type of treatment. They might need a different type of reward. Those that react to limited time offers, those that react to something new might need a different type of communication. And having an ability to react appropriately to the customer's value prop and what and how they engage with you is really important too, because as we know, some will react to email, some will react to push notifications on the app, some react to text messages. And you've got to ask yourself, if you can't build a system that enables you to be able to accommodate that variability and get closer to one-to-one customer, and we have that chapter called guest centricity in the book. If you can't get closer to being able to do that, then maybe you're not ready for a loyalty program yet, because you want to build with the way in which restaurants are heading in this space.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just going to give a little of my opinion here.
Go for it.
I'm such a wallflower. I think the industry is completely stuck with loyalty. And my big bet, the way your big bet is around the digitally native restaurant, I would say that the restaurant that figures out how to make a modern, next level, actual loyalty program in restaurants is the one that's going to win. Because I think nobody's doing it very well. I think very few people, maybe Chick-fil-A, maybe. But I'm a consumer. I go to lots of fast casual restaurants, not that many QSRs, but lots of fast casuals. And it just kind of ticks me off. I got to say, recently, today I actually went to one of my favorite spots, and this is a very well-known restaurant. They just came out with a new loyalty program. It's a new app. You can tell they invested millions of dollars in this app. It looks next level. One of the tiers is a paid tier. I'm like, are you kidding me? I have to pay $10 a month to join you. I'm so confused. Right? So I just think it's a bit of a mess. I think we're really stuck. I would think we've been stuck with figuring this out for a while. Maybe when, we get somewhere close to understanding what data matters, what we've been talking about here for a bit, and being able to actually personalize, which by the way is very hard. Meredith, you mentioned, in the beginning, like Amazon, right? It's not easy. And I don't mean to say that any of this is easy, but I think that it is an untapped area. Whoever's going to figure that out is going to some smooth sailing.
I think you're right. I mean, it is problematic, right? In the industry right now, I think there's a lot of money spent on loyalty programs in terms of discounts and things like that. Question mark if it's driving behavior. I think when it is more customized, more personalized, it does drive behavior. And I think that example you just brought up of the paid tier is an interesting one, right? Because you pay to belong to Amazon Prime, I bet. And in many ways, that's like the future loyalty program, right? Someone
Mhm.
pays to be in it, and then they get discounts because they're in it. They get benefits like free and faster delivery because they're in it, and their entire experience is personalized compared to somebody who maybe hasn't opted into that and can't get the free delivery. So, and that's kind of where travel ended up as well, right? I mean, yes,
Mhm.
you get a free plane ticket, but they've now, inflated the miles needed to go anywhere so much that it's like, is that really valuable? No, the reason I love loyalty programs on airlines and hotels is because I get access, right? They let me bring a bag aboard. They let me come on early. They let me buy tickets and get seats when other people can't. Like these kinds of benefits in terms of accessing the brand
Mhm.
are way more
Mhm.
important to me
Yeah.
than actually being able to redeem miles for a ticket. And right now, restaurants are very stuck in the like redeem miles phase, right? Which we
Mhm.
probably all remember from 20 years ago. And I
Mhm.
think over time, that will evolve to be more about personalization, access,
Mhm.
benefits, and less about a discount per se. And as that happens, I think that'll be the
It's a
You
really
know,
good point. It's a really good point because I do
the,
pay for Prime, but I've been paying it forever, so I don't even realize it anymore.
You signed up when it was like super cheap, and now they jack the price on you, and you haven't looked at your credit card
Yeah, because
in
it's on
10
like
years.
auto
I
renew.
get you.
yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
but the
look what
$10 was $10 a month. It was
Yeah.
$10 a month.
Yeah.
So I'm
yeah.
already thinking, well, yeah. So I feel like, and I looked at the perks, and the perks weren't great. Like it wasn't like some of the access stuff you're talking about.
You
Because
have
I
to be
do
a
agree.
super user for that tier to make sense, I think.
Yeah,
I think
and
what
I
Panera did
and I
last
have
year was Panera's
go
like
ahead.
Sip Club, for example, right? That really
Mhm.
demonstrated for me a great example of being able to drive frequency, where they gave everyone a membership for free, and you were able to go in every day and get a free cup of coffee. Now there were two things that they
Yep.
were doing from that. They were creating that habit of people going to Panera more often, and then similarly they were giving customer information. And so then whatever it was, a month or two later, when they started charging 10 to 12 months for that privilege, then of course they will clearly will lose some customers that don't get the freeness of it anymore, but they've got the customer information, and they've started
Mhm.
to suggest that subscription might be a way forward. So I think we're seeing a rise of the subscription program across restaurants right now. I think Sweetgreen just came out with theirs recently as well. And so it'll be interesting to see whether that is a kind of pay to play for a certain type of loyal customer.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to move to the last topic that I'd like to talk to you about, which is this concept of a new restaurant operating system, which we mentioned already in the conversation. We've alluded to it. Something that we looked at when I first got here 4 years ago, and we were looking at the branding for Q. We were thinking about calling it like a restaurant operating system. And in the conclusion of your book, I'm going to just read this paragraph that I highlighted. Most restaurants will follow the path to digital maturity and increasingly incorporate technology into their business. Some will go straight to the end game, employing holistic software and plug in headless API commerce functions as they are invented. And then you go on to talk about this whole idea of rethinking your business operating and your technologies. Where do you believe restaurants should start today if they haven't already started on this journey?
Well, I know where I would start. I mean, so as a hobby, I'm sure this won't surprise you. I do things like think about inventing new restaurant concepts and what they would be like and what would be on the menu and how it would interact. My hobbies, I'm obviously in the right job because I also really like to draw floor plans of homes and businesses. Like I clearly have ended up in the right place. But whenever I think about a new restaurant concept, I always think about one that has virtual restaurants built into it from the get-go, meaning the ingredients are all cross-utilized and they are pushed out in different ways to different segments, occasions, day parts, with brands that are customized to those things and therefore easily findable. And as I think about putting that all together, again, it goes back to the conversation we were having at the very beginning about how the menu is like the root of that, right? The build materials for each one of those menu items and how they're created, stretching all the way back into the supply chain and inventory and prep cycles and all those things. So I always think about building the virtual restaurants in from the beginning from a menu design perspective. And then once you do that, you start to think, okay, well, that means I'm going to need to be inherently very digital because many of these concepts will not be explained through any kind of brick and mortar traditional advertising. So I need to make sure that people can find me and access me digitally. And so I start to put all of that together in. And, as you start to build this future concept, you start to think, this won't work if I use piecemeal technology to put it together, right? Like I would need one of this and one of those and one of these, and like it's just going to be a mess. And even as simple as you think about some of the aggregators that are out there today, if you have a whole bunch of brands and a whole bunch of locations and a whole bunch of platforms, the cost of the aggregation technology becomes insurmountable because the way that it works is per brand, per location, per month. And it's too expensive, right? So you have to fundamentally rethink, what am I trying to do and what are the right tools for the job to do that? And of course, I'm totally biased because I work at a delivery centric software company. And our answer to that question is, well, you need one holistic system that's designed specifically to do that thing. So that is certainly where I end up after designing the kind of consumer fun stuff of the menu. And I think that some restaurants will come to that conclusion. It's just too hard to maintain a whole bunch of staff to figure out how to stitch together all of these different pieces of technology and keep them up to date. It's much easier to say, find me the right technology to solve this specific problem, and then I'm going to trust that technology company to continue to innovate and keep it up to date.
Right.
We use this concept called future back thinking. I think you coined that from Yum days, right, Meredith?
Yeah.
And I think the whole idea here is to try and help a restaurant think about where they want to be, not just now, but to think where they're going to be in 5-6 years from now. And that's a difficult conversation to have. And it's got nothing to do with technology. It's about, how do you want to service your guests 5 to 6, 10 years from now? What is that going to look like? What's the extent to which we feel that's the way in which we want to service our customers? And then from that, it's then being able to develop the stages. The whole idea of the path to digital maturity is to help people find where they are today. And then from that, to be able to say, how far do we want to go? We don't think every restaurant is going to get through the full path, and that's fine. But they've got to accept where they're going to reach on that maturity pathway, because then it means they don't have to push beyond the realms of what they think is possible for their brand, for their budget, for their capabilities. And so where do you want to be? Think backwards, reverse engineer, and then you can develop your tech stack in a very much more focused fashion. It's almost like watching kids with 3 or 4 different new Lego boxes, right? Are you going to actually design something with the actual end intent in mind? Or are you going to take all the 4 different boxes and plug them all together and create something new, which won't necessarily be as functionally well designed as going from the initial piece? And I think if you can design with the end in mind, you're going to be in a much better place to have the right outcome for you and your guest.
Yeah. Both two great strategies there that you shared. The future back think, is that what it's called? Future back think?
Future back thinking. Yeah.
Yeah, and then just the whole, Meredith, the way you're talking about sketching out this whole idea with the restaurants having the virtual brands embedded in them, and being able to utilize, the ingredients, cross brand. Sometimes I have the most compassion for these larger sort of legacy brands, if you will, the 30, 40, 50-year-old brands. What do you say to them when you're talking about these topics?
Oh my gosh, I
Your
get so
biggest
excited
your
because I
biggest
think
risk
about
is
what
your
they
mindset.
I think about what they could be, honestly. Like I see that footprint and I think, you have so much capital in the ground. You have this amazing footprint. It could be anything. And what if instead of thinking, how do I make XYZ brand marginally better with that footprint, maybe think, oh my gosh, I have this amazing footprint that covers, 70% of America. What could I do with it? Like
hmm
70% of Americans live within 5 miles. How could I use that? That's so
hmm
exciting. And if you turn the question on its head that way, you kind of start to think like, I could put all these virtual brands in. And that's why I have so much respect for like Wade Allen when he was at Chili's coming up with It's Just Wings, or the team at Chuck E. Cheese coming up with Pasquale's. Like, they really were saying, we have this amazing footprint. How can it be used? And I love that. That's so fun to me.
Yeah.
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 I
And
think
we have
there's
seen this trend of restaurants acquiring other restaurant brands, right? And doing the co-branding. So two
Yeah,
restaurants in
I
one
know.
spot.
I have a little PTSD from co-branding, having been at Yum. So I'm just gonna like go on my soapbox for a minute here about that one. So there's a difference between co-branding in a building and virtual brands. And let me talk to you about the difference between those things. So Yum quite famously decided, oh my gosh, we have Long John Silver's, we have A&W, we have Pizza Hut, we have Taco Bell, we have KFC. What if we just started putting them all in the same building together? Because then we would basically reduce the construction cost by half because it'd get associated with each brand, but you'd have a higher top line because you'd have two brands in the same building. Amazing, genius, right? And the problem was, and the reason why I had PTSD from it, because I spent a lot of time rebuilding buildings to only have one brand in them. These brands didn't share common ingredients. They didn't share cooking styles. They didn't even share cooking processes, right? Some were like prep and assemble. Some were batch hold. Some of them were made to order. Like, you can't mix those things in the back of house or your kitchen will completely blow up. And in the front of house, you had totally different brand representation. Like, we literally had, a building that would have multiple logos on the outside, and then like half the room would be red and half the room would be purple. Like, what? It doesn't make any sense. And how is that different from modern virtual brands? Well, modern virtual brand, first of all, would probably not put all the brand names on the building, and they would not try to make, a whole bunch of different brand representations in the same physical space. A whole bunch of the virtual brands would exist as they are called virtual brands, only virtually, right? They wouldn't be in that brick and mortar represented to the consumer, first of all. And then second of all, a good virtual brand, and anyone who knows what they're doing, and by anyone, I mean these companies that do this professionally, like Neil Outpost from Franklin Junction and BDC and NextBite, they know I am not going to stick something in that kitchen unless that kitchen is capable of doing it. And that means common ingredients, same cooking styles, same cooking process. And that is fundamentally different, right? So I get really nervous when I see these people doing these like multi-branded situations. I'm like, I don't know well enough from the outside to say whether or not that's the same cooking style, but having been through it myself, I am concerned.
You do have PTSD.
I do.
So you're not really a fan of the co-branded. I mean, I'm even thinking of the one that probably has made it the longest, which is the Baskin Robbins Dunkin'. Is that right? That, you see those two together a lot.
Mhm. That's probably fine.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they're different.
Carl, you've been
forms, right?
trying to talk. You just can't
Oh,
get a word out
I'm
with
just
these
letting you
women.
ladies have a chit chat. What can it say? Look, I'll come back to your first question about the legacy brands out there, and the piece for me, Jen, is both Meredith and I have worked for huge brands before and big corporate environments, and I think there's a question really for the executives in those environments right now to be able to say, how do you build towards a future that you might not be there for? There's so much in-year activity when you're in those types of environments where you're trying to deliver upon your in-year targets, because that's the thing that's going to help you to get to the next job up the chain. And the challenge for restaurants today is there's so much change happening that you have to have that future back thinking again to be able to say, how can we put in place the infrastructure today, not just in terms of tech, but in terms of people and mindset and vision that potentially I might not be here to see through. And I think the challenge of being able to disrupt a set way of working is really difficult for folks that have been in that system for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really about just being able to say, I mean, that, the chapter isn't digitally native restaurant. It's actually called disrupt yourself. And that's why it's far more difficult for those established brands to disrupt themselves, because they're building on what they did last year. And to change that approach is really difficult. So the better ones out there, you think of like what PF Chang's are doing with creating a completely different group, which are to-go concepts. That is a great way of being able to pilot some innovation and do it in a way that actually allows you to say, okay, does this model work? And it doesn't necessarily disrupt the standard business model. That's what those
Mothership.
type of
Yeah.
models need to think about.
Yeah, that's a great example. It's a great example. Okay, well, as we wrap here, thank you both for weighing in on that. Last question. What is the one thing this year in the restaurant industry that surprised you? You didn't expect.
I know. You speaking to Derek Jeter at RLC and I love that post. It did amuse me. And the fact that he came back and suggested it was got nothing to do with the timing of the birth of your children, but more to do with the other. So
You had to get me to blush, Carl. Come on, it's a serious question. Now I'm all befuddled.
Here we go. We'll let Meredith answer.
I did not expect the price premiums on third-party marketplaces to get as high as they've gotten. When it first started happening, I think Carl and I went on record saying, maybe this is okay for the big national chains to do because people know them and have been in their physical brick and mortar and have a connotation of what their value is. And so that value image is not being set by what they see on the third-party marketplaces. But, oh man, it seems risky for a small independent brand that maybe the first touch point a consumer ever has with them is on those marketplaces. And therefore their value perception is going to be colored by what they experience on the marketplaces. And so we were not a wholehearted, yes, you should absolutely price up places. We were like, you need to tread carefully here. And it's very interesting that pretty much every restaurant universally has just said, yeah, no, we don't make as much money on the third-party marketplaces, so we're pricing them up, and the consumer understands and they're willing to pay for convenience. And I did not see everyone doing it, and I did not see everyone doing it to the extent that they've done it. And I think the repercussions of that have yet to be truly understood.
I'll give you a serious answer now, Jen, although I still like my first one. And that would be SVB, right? So the impact to the startup and tech environment and how that is creating a situation now for a lot of the restaurant tech companies that are still startups that are bringing this innovation to the industry to actually really rethink their business model. And what I mean by that is they got to get to profitability sooner. They can't rely on huge amounts of VC money just to allow them to have long periods of time to get to proof of concept. And that's going to change, I think, a lot of the focus and a lot of the MVPs that exist out there to really help restaurants see that innovation, but perhaps in not an elaborate fashion that we had initially seen. And so I think we're going to see more focused innovation come through, perhaps fewer in number because of what's going to have the knock-on effect of SVB in the kind of capital market environment. But I think that's going to have a role to really make sure that the cream rises to the top, if you will, of what's available out there.
Right. Great. Love it. Love it, guys. Well, I want to wrap and thank you both so much for the excellent job that you did on your second book. I liked the first book, but I love the second book. I'm just going to say it. It felt just like very embraceable.
Interesting.
It felt very usable. I thought you took a lot of the concepts in the first book and really hit them home and made them embraceable, just to keep using that word. So thank you so much. You're doing a great service to the industry, to restaurants everywhere. And where can we get the book? It's not on audiobook yet, right? It's
all being recorded. It's coming out very, very soon. If you want me to read the book to you, whether if you're interested in the content or for me to help you sleep at night, it serves both purposes. But yes, of course, you'll be able to get that on Audible. Our answer as to where to get the book depends whether you're a third-party kind of person or a first-party person. Of course, it's available on Amazon in hardcover, paperback, and Kindle. But if you'd like to support first party, head to our website, which is deliveringthedigitalrestaurant.com. There you'll be able to get a copy. You'll even be able to get a bundle of both books if you haven't read the first book. And if you're looking for additional podcasts beyond Restaurants Reinvented, then check out Meredith and I. Every couple of weeks, we talk about 5 headlines affecting the world of restaurants and technology and off-premise. And that one's called The Digital Restaurant. So we'd love to have any of your listeners come and listen to us as well.
Great content. Great content. Thank you so much for all the things you're doing to help restaurants digitize and get more modern for the consumer. So appreciate you guys. Thank you, Meredith. Thank you, Carl. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks.
Cheerio.
Thank you for checking out this episode of Restaurants Reinvented. This show is brought to you by Q, a restaurant tech company paving a brighter future for operators with the industry's first unified commerce platform. If you enjoyed what you learned in this episode, make sure to follow Restaurants Reinvented in your favorite podcast app or visit qbeyond.com, that's QUBEYOND.com /podcast to find all of your latest episodes.